are three things. First, what I'd like to do is to talk about the presidential and the national elections, the presidency, the Senate, and what happened in the House of Representatives. Secondly, I'd like to talk about what's occurred here in Virginia through the election cycle, both for the presidency, the senatorial and congressional races, and the redistricting referendum. And then thirdly, look forward to 2021 here in Virginia and talk about what might be coming our way then, which will be of continuing interest, obviously. So let me just talk about the presidential election first. In terms of the outcome, as far as I could tell, we're going to see, in terms of the popular vote, a fairly decisive victory by Joe Biden. Could well turn out to be close to double the margin that Hillary Clinton had. Right now, I think it's about 4.6 million votes. It's likely to get to well over 5 million votes by the time everything is counted. He's ahead by about 3 percentage points right now. It'll probably be closer to 4 by the time everything's counted. Now, of course, that doesn't mean very much or really anything in a national election because we're talking about electoral college votes, and that those races were in some ways closer, but at the end, my sense is that this is going to look very much to be almost the reverse of what occurred last time, where Donald Trump got 306 electoral votes. It's not out of the question that that would be the exact number that Joe Biden will wind up with. So very quickly, in terms of what seemed to happen in these competitive states right now and where we are. My sense is that they have yet to call North Carolina and Alaska. I think both of those states will go to the president. I don't quite know why they haven't called North Carolina. I'm not even sure there's a sufficient number of votes left to be counted to actually change things in that front. In terms of the other battleground states that have yet to be called completely, Arizona, Biden has a small lead there. It's about 15,000 votes. My sense is that that is going to remain Biden. That Trump could potentially bring that down some, but I don't quite personally see how there's going to be a 15,000 vote swing unless there are some things that happen or there are more votes out there than they've been talking about. Georgia, Biden has extended his lead to over 11,000 votes. That will be in recount territory, as Wisconsin is, in all likelihood. Arizona is unlikely to be a recount because they have a much stricter, stringent requirement for recounts. Rather than 0.5%, it's 0.1 of 1% there. So unless the president is able to move that quickly down there, it looks like it's going to be at that without a recount. In terms of what happened here, Joe Biden, as we know, reconstructed that blue wall. He won Wisconsin by 20,000 votes, which is about similar to the margin that Hillary Clinton won last time, or I mean that Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton last time. Biden won Michigan handily, actually, by about 3 percentage points, smaller than some of the polls were showing, but clearly wound up winning that by a significant margin. He's up between 45 and 50,000 votes in Pennsylvania, and that's likely to get larger as they finalize going through provisional ballots and the like. So that margin is likely to be larger than we had seen in the in 2016. So if we look at the election, Biden has reconstructed the blue wall, and then he seems to have gone and carried Georgia, at least in the before a runoff. Very doubtful that a runoff changes 11,000 votes, and carries Arizona as well. So by and large, what we see is a pretty significant and decisive win by Joe Biden. If we look at the popular vote, that's kind of interesting. The Democrats have won 7 of the last 8 presidential elections in the popular vote, but it shows you how the Electoral College actually has started to magnify Republican influence there. because the Democratic votes tend to be concentrated in some of these big states where the Republicans carry state after state in the heartland of America. Now, in terms of what we saw out of the election and how to explain it, I think the best explanation I've seen of trying to summarize and try to really capture what the big distinction is becoming in American politics is someone who wrote the other day that said this election can be explained by density and diplomacy. And basically what we're seeing is the Democrats are running very, very strong in the major metropolitan areas for the most part. I think probably South Florida, Miami-Dade might be a little sort of counter to that because Donald Trump did much better there for a particular reason. But overall, what you're finding is that places that have high density, dense metropolitan areas where you have significant numbers of people with college and postgraduate degrees, those places are trending Democratic. So by and large, we're seeing that occur over time. So for example, in 2008 and 2012, Virginia and Colorado were battleground states. By 2020, they're not battleground states. And that can be explained, as we'll see in Virginia, in part by the dense metropolitan areas and the significant number of people with college and postgraduate degrees. Georgia is another example of that what you find in Georgia is that a significant percentage of the state's population are really in this broad Atlanta metropolitan area. And we saw that Joe Biden was not only carrying the city of Atlanta, but he was carrying and doing very well in a number of the surrounding suburbs outside of Atlanta. So that is kind of one way of looking at this. The Democrats did a very good job, I think, in some states of turning out more voters than they turned out in 2016. Not in every state, but overall the turnout was much larger on both sides, the Democratic side and the Republican side. So I give the Democrats really credit for that. I think in Georgia, immense credit has to go to Stacey Abrams and what she had done, not just this year, but over a 3 or 4 year period. And in particular, getting the law changed in Georgia. So there's actually automatic registration when you get a driver's license. There's nothing, it's just automatic. And so there's far more people registered now in that front. So the Democrats overall were able to have a significant turnout. Now, let me try to get a little more granular about this on this front. And there are some interesting results when you look at that as far as we could tell. There was a question before the campaign about whether Joe Biden should try to appeal to the white working class voters that had abandoned the Democratic Party and gone over to Trump, or whether he should just go and sort of appeal to the more progressive groups and the liberal groups. And essentially what you have to do, I think, is a little of both, and that's what Biden did. So on one hand, Donald Trump ran still extraordinarily strong with non-college educated white working class voters. But in many of these key states, Joe Biden was able to run slightly, better than Hillary Clinton. In a lot of places, it was 0.5 percentage point, 1 percentage point, 1.5 percentage points. But when you take a look at how close this election was in these battleground states, even where you're talking about a 70,000 vote margin, if you start adding on a percentage point or 2 percentage points in places that Donald Trump had carried, that really makes an impact. Donald Trump, for his sake, actually did better in some of the urban cities than he previously did. There's some belief that he did better among African-American men than he did in 2016. And then there's pretty strong evidence that he did better, particularly with Latino men than previously. And in fact, in some places outside of the major metropolitan areas, South Texas, he just completely reversed, margins that Hillary Clinton carried with 52%. In some of these smaller communities, Trump carried them with 60 and 70%. So we saw a little bit of change there as well. But for Biden, the dynamic of doing better, getting higher turnout in the African-American community, doing better in these suburban areas, and having these slight cutting in by a small margin to Donald Trump's totals in these white working class communities in the battleground states was enough for him to get this lead. So now the question becomes really, in terms of the presidential race, what's next? And there are two theories out there right now, as far as I could tell. The first theory that we're hearing is what I call the give Trump time theory. There's this notion that the president is the kind of person who finds it very difficult to accept a loss, and that he really hasn't been able to accept it yet, but that he will get around to it. And that what's going on right now is some attempt to sort of work within his unusual psychology, and that at some point we will begin to see a transition that he will accept and will go along with. And I think I read a lot about that. I hear a lot about that on the news, and maybe that's the case. The second position is that something more sinister might be occurring, and that what is actually happening is that the president is really going to try to continue to challenge these results for quite some time. That this is not just a sort of perfunctory effort of going through the courts and potentially thinking about trying to get state legislatures to overturn the results of their people, but that really this is an organized effort to find some way to challenge the election, and it has a number of components to it. The first are sort of these legal challenges in any number of states, particularly Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia. The challenge is really that it is how far can you go if you lose with the Joe Biden getting 306 electoral votes, because then it's not just one state. So I could imagine, for example, if it was 279 electoral votes, and you're really talking about just if Wisconsin changes, you change it, or if Pennsylvania changed, you change it. But now you'd have to change, if he gets 306, multiple states. And at least so far, none of the legal challenges that I have seen have had the kind of meat to it that I think would enable a court to say, not only is it a viable challenge on its merits, but it could actually change the outcome of the results in the states. So that's part of the challenge there, but certainly there's going to be these legal challenges. And I think last night that the issue that occurred with the Justice Department, where Bill Barr suggested that the Justice Department could begin to investigate potential fraud prior to the time that a state certified its results, and you had the head of the election fraud division of the Justice Department resign in protest, tells you that in some sense there is probably a greater degree of seriousness about trying to find ways to see if this election, if these results could be seriously challenged on that front. And secondly, you have a whole set of Republican office holders who are continuing in many ways not to accept the results of the election. At first, it was a number of people simply talking about, let's count all the legal votes and let's make sure that the recounts occur and that they're challenged. But now you have, in some ways, Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, really going out on a limb and basically suggesting, I thought, without much evidence, that Philadelphia and Detroit are simply corrupt and shouldn't even accept their results. We've seen the two Republican senators call for the resignation of the Secretary of State in Georgia, who is a fellow Republican, on this front. And so we're seeing a lot of agitation. And I guess the question that I have on this second point is, how far does the president go? If we begin to see the president hold rallies around the country, trying to mobilize and motivate his base on the grounds that somehow this election has been stolen, I actually think we enter really even new territory, and that we've never seen before. He may be there now, but we're certainly going forward with that. My concern, which is deep on this, that on one hand, I would like to believe this first theory, that this is simply a sort of a time to sort of deal with the peculiar psychology of the president, and that ultimately he will get around to acceptance and this will end. But if we continue down this second path, I worry there's going to be a very substantial reaction as well, both from Trump supporters and Trump and non-Trump voters, and that we could go into even more protest and potential violence. Tom Friedman, I heard last night, the wonderful columnist for the New York Times, and he really raised that specter a little bit. And so I'm just hoping that we get to some kind of conclusion, and we get to it relatively soon, and we don't have the situation really get out of hand. I think at a minimum, there's going to be large percentages of the Trump voters, I don't think all by any means, but a significant percentage are going to believe that this election is stolen from them. And that's probably not good for democracy, but that's basically where we are. So let me now turn to the senatorial races. And here we had something that the result was a result that was not predicted by most people. If you think back at it, a week or 2 weeks before the election, the Democrats seemed to believe that they were not only going to repudiate and defeat Donald Trump, but they were going to repudiate Trumpism, and they were going to defeat many of the senators that they had labeled Trump enablers. The Democrats believed that they were certainly going to beat Susan Collins, that they were certainly going to beat Tom Tillis in North Carolina, they were going to beat Cory Gardner, and they were going to beat Martha McSally. So the Democrats believed really that they were going to win a minimum of 4 seats, and that if Donald Trump was elected president, they would have at least a 50-50 margin, and that they had 3 or 4 other chances as well, that they would have a chance in Iowa. They put tons of money into Jamie Harrison's race in South Carolina. They believed they had a chance in Kansas as time went on, Montana. So the Democrats were talking about 50 as a floor, and 54, 55 senators as a ceiling. And in fact, if you look at this, there was significant discussion about whether they're going to pack the court, what they were going to do to once they had this majority. And ultimately, as we look at this, they certainly were way ahead of their skis on this, that at the end of the day, right now, it's 48-48, but the likelihood is very clear that it's going to be 50-48 pretty soon. They have not called the North Carolina race. Tom Tillis is actually further ahead of Cunningham than Trump is ahead of Biden in North Carolina. I don't see any way that Tillis loses on that front. So I think Tillis wins North Carolina. And then finally, I think in Alaska, they haven't called that. I think it's very clear, not clear, I think it's very likely that the Republican Senator Sullivan stays on in Alaska to give us 50-48 and brings the Senate down to that Georgia runoff. That's going to be a runoff like we've never seen before, with 2 senators in all likelihood, 2 Democratic candidates running against 2 incumbent Republican senators. Typically in runoffs in Georgia, Republicans have done much better than Democrats. They've won the vast majority of them over the last 15, 20 years. These statewide runoffs that they have in Georgia because of the peculiar law that if you don't get 50%, you have to enter a runoff. Republicans have done very well on these. The Democrats, certainly with Stacey Abrams, have shown a tremendous capacity to mobilize voters in Georgia. But I would note that both Ossoff and Warnock ran behind Joe Biden in this election. Ossoff just had there was one opponent and a third party candidate. He not only lost the election by almost 2 percentage points to Purdue, but he ran obviously behind Biden as well. So the challenge for Democrats is very significant in these runoffs. They would have to really find a way to generate a turnout that they traditionally have not had. These will be held on January 5th, right in the middle of winter. And so, but what I can tell you is that the dollars that are going to go into this are going to be huge. And any Georgia voter who was tired of political commercials is going to have to turn off their TV for another 2 months now prior to seeing what happens there. Similar thing I think happened in the House of Representatives. The Democrats were talking about a 10 to 15 seat pickup. Actually, the issue is going to be how many seats do the Republicans pick up? It's going to be between 5 and 10, could be even a little more. But this is really, I think, something that the Democrats had not predicted, because they basically thought that once again, that along with defeating Donald Trump, there would be a defeat of Trumpism, there would be a defeat of Republicans who they had said had enabled him. And that's just not something that has occurred here, that the Republicans did quite well in some of the districts that the Democrats had carried in 2018. They're going to take back a couple of seats in the Los Angeles suburbs, for example. I'll talk about Virginia in a moment, but Abigail Spanberger was involved in a very, very close race. So this was pretty remarkable sort of change from what we had seen. And I think what was apparent there is that, the Democrats, are struggling to define exactly what they are as a party and who represents their party. And it's a challenge because of the nature of politics. Where the Democrats have the most population, have the most people, it is largely a progressive party. In California, in New York, and the urban metropolitan areas. However, to win elections district by district, that what you find is that some of the progressive appeals are not very popular. Defund the police, perhaps one of the worst political slogans that had emerged. Now, it wasn't necessarily one that came out of the Democratic Party, but it was one that they got saddled with in any number of localities, and in some suburban localities where they lost seats that they had taken in 2018. And then finally in South Florida, Joe Biden had trouble and the Democrats had trouble. We saw a number of at least 2 Democratic incumbent congresspeople being knocked off in South Florida, largely because the peculiarities of that of the politics in that area, where the president and the Republicans had been very successful in using the Democratic Socialist label and the Socialist label, attach them to Democrats that, to AOC, Bernie Sanders, and basically then argued that Biden and these other Congress people were really beholden in some ways to them and voted along with the socialists. And that was a pretty powerful argument there. One that you're going to continue to see. Already this morning, for example, in Georgia, we have seen a Fox News report that says when Reverend Warnock was assistant pastor at a church 25 years ago, they invited Fidel Castro to the church and praised Fidel Castro. So That's the kind of argument that does work somewhere, but it exposes this sort of broader divide in the Democratic Party between the progressive wing that largely, is not that worried about Republican challengers in their own districts, and the more moderate districts, more moderate Democrats trying to win in more complicated districts where there are very different constituencies on that front. And so at the end of the day, the Democrats find that they were able, I think they were able to elect Joe Biden, but they certainly weren't able to bring about this progressive transformation of American politics that they had hoped to bring about and that they were talking about at that time. Finally, I would just say at the national level, there was some thought about, what's happened with these polls. What in the world is going on with these pollsters? And what we see is a couple of different things. First, at the national popular vote level, the pollsters are going to turn out to be off, but not that much. They were basically between 7 and 8 points. As I said, I think it's going to wind up somewhere around 5 points. That's certainly within a margin of error, and it's not that wrong. It's not that off. But where they were off, once again, horribly, with some of the numbers that they put forward in the upper Midwest. Wisconsin being the prime example. ABC, Washington Post poll, had Biden winning Wisconsin by 17 points the week before the election, the Friday before the election. Almost all the polls in Wisconsin had Biden up by 6, 8, 10, 12, and he won by just a little less than 1. Even in Michigan, which Biden wins handily, ultimately by 3 percentage points, which is a pretty decent sized margin, they had him up by 8, 10, 12. So what we're seeing, I think, is the continuing concern about polling. Now, in their defense, the argument they would make is that they picked essentially 48 of the 50 states correctly. The 2 states that they wound up getting incorrect in terms of the ultimate result were Florida and North Carolina. But when you take a look at the polls, they were off in some other ways. The odd thing about this, to go on a little further, is that it wasn't just the public polls that were wrong. It were the private polls as well. It was the polls that the candidates used to spend money. And they were off in both parties. The Republican pollsters were off, the Democratic pollsters were off. And ultimately, that resulted in financial decisions that in some ways, in retrospect, look crazy. And that was combined with the fact that some individuals could actually fundraise, some individual candidates could fundraise and raise a lot of money when they really didn't have that much chance of winning. And 2 examples of that, one is Jamie Harrison in South Carolina had one poll that showed him even. Ultimately, he lost by 16 points to Lindsey Graham and raised a ton of money that, if you take a look at it, the Democrats could have used far better in North Carolina than they did in South Carolina. And then also, because so many Democrats dislike and hate Mitch McConnell, Amy McGrath, not through the party, but through herself and Act Blue, raised an absolute ton of money again to run against Mitch McConnell in a race that had no chance of being close at all. But to get back to the polling issue, certainly there is going to be real concern about, how can you be so far off in some of these states 2 elections in a row? The pollsters, by and large, believe this time that they had what they called compensated for their error last time. That there was this sort of general mea culpa among pollsters after 2016, where they recognized that they had not accounted for the turnout capacity of Donald Trump in the rural areas and among white working class voters. And so they all said that they had adjusted their models, that they had done this again. And then, what you see nationally or particularly in some of these battleground states, they missed again. Is it just bad polling? Or is it that they just have a tough time reaching some kind of people? I think there are two challenges that are in polling today. One is simply the overall challenge of getting representative samples to answer the phone. In my the last time I used to do a lot of polling for clients. I don't do very much any longer. Well, I remember the last poll I had done after the first night. I, got the information from the call center, and it was like 68% of the people who answered the phone were over 65. And I just thought it was getting to the point where trying to weight the numbers according to the population was getting ridiculous. In some ways, it's getting tougher and tougher to do that. That was one problem. I think a second problem that may be occurring may not be all that widespread, but I think it is. I think among some voters, and particularly likely Trump supporters, is that what you find is that they see the pollsters as part of the establishment. They're part of the media. They're part of the, part of the political class. They're part of the elite class that they don't particularly like, and they may not give them the time of day. And one other problem that the pollsters themselves have identified over time is that if there's bad news coming out about your person, they've lost a debate, or maybe that they're just likely to lose the election, you're less likely to answer a poll when things aren't going that well for the person you like. And all that does is that it then exaggerates the problem. It just multiplies it, it compounds it in that front. So I think there's a little of that going on as well. If all the media are saying Donald Trump's way behind, maybe Donald Trump's supporters just don't even bother to talk. But whatever that means, whatever that tells us, is that clearly there needs to be a reckoning with polling, and part of that reckoning is going to be driven by the parties themselves, who I think are sick and tired of spending millions of dollars on inaccurate and incorrect information there. Okay, so let's now turn to Virginia and the results here in Virginia. At the presidential level, the senatorial level, this is the place where the polls were basically correct. They were all predicting a double-digit win for Biden. It's very close to double digits, might be 9 points. They were predicting a double-digit win for Warner. He'll probably win by 11 or 12. There were some sort of reporting glitches early on election night that made it seem very different. But once the final results came in, both at the presidential level and the senatorial level, the Democrats coasted. And so that tells us once again, from my point of view, what that did was to put a punctuation point on where we are statewide in Virginia right now. And this has been going on for some time, been going on from 2005 on. In elections for governor, senator, and president, the Republicans have won once since 2005, and that was Bob McDonnell in 2009. So that's kind of where we are. This election did nothing but to, punctuate it, to put an exclamation point on it. And again, it's sort of the density and diploma issue here, if you look at it. Donald Trump carried more localities and jurisdictions than Joe Biden, but he carried all the small ones. Joe Biden carried every large jurisdiction in Virginia, winning, I think, Virginia Beach since the first time since 1948 or something like that. Chesterfield County, very much the same way, carried both of those places. When I looked last week, he had carried Fairfax County by 240,000 votes, and they were still counting votes. So what has happened in Virginia is that we're really seeing the dominance of the metro areas, Northern Virginia, RVA, Hampton Roads, all of those tending blue. And the Republicans are winning the rural areas by unbelievably large margins. I mean, Tazewell, I think, was 83% Trump. Smith was 82 or 84% Trump. I mean, these margins are just extraordinary in the rural areas, but they can't compete with the margins that are coming out of the suburban areas. And that shows, I think, the challenge for the Republican Party going forward about how they can they find candidates that can somehow transcend the rural metro area divide that we're seeing in Virginia right now. And that is something they have yet to be able to do. And that's going to be crucial to them going forward right now. And that is a long thing. And this problem has really been exacerbated by Donald Trump, because it was happening for a while that we were seeing these demographic shifts in the suburbs. You know, you might have remembered that Trump called the suburbs, talked about it as if they were, filled with, white suburban housewives, was the sort of defining feature of the suburbs. It's not any longer. They are, multiracial, extraordinarily diverse communities in Virginia, and they are not, often highly educated, and they're not leaning in any Republican direction. They're the epitome of this sort of density and diplomas issue that affected the party nationally there. So no big surprise, but really puts that punctuation point on what the challenge is for the Republicans. The Democrats clearly have a huge challenge in the rural areas. They can't, they don't do very well, with the exception of the counties that have significant African-American population in South Side. And they really need to find some way of addressing that. But so long as they're running up these incredible margins in the suburbs, that they haven't paid a price for the what's happened to them in the rural areas. Now, what I like to say is about Donald Trump exacerbating the problem is that, you may recall, one of his big selling points was that he was going to drain the swamp in Washington. And I jokingly say what he has done is to drain Northern Virginia of Republicans. If you take a look right now on the Republican side, there's one Republican who I think represents part of Prince William, and no Republicans, not a single Republican that represents part of Fairfax County in the General Assembly. So that just kind of tells you what the situation is for the Republican Party there. Now, if we go on to the congressional races, basically what we wind up in Virginia is the status quo. The Republicans had hoped to be able to pick off a couple of Democrats, in particular, Elaine Luria and Abigail Spanberger. Elaine Luria won the rematch with Scott Taylor, again, relatively handily. That Taylor, I think, was still harmed by the election scandal that had occurred and was a story in 2018. It was a story again. Luria kept it up there. Taylor, very self-confident guy, but I think he put his foot in his mouth a little bit in one of the debates where he said that, where Elaine Luria was talking about her endorsement by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And he noted that she had been graded on a curve. And it took Luria about 2 seconds to say, I'd like to speak to all the women in the audience right now. And I'd like to ask them how many of them have faced this kind of issue in right now or in the past. And I think that was very impressive. And indeed, I should have mentioned that the polls didn't show this, but when I was, when you were hearing the reaction of people to the Biden victory, what impressed me so much was that there was very few people out in the streets. So, and I guess people in the streets that they were talking to were, in many instances, younger. But very few of them really spoke about Biden per se, as much as they spoke about Kamala Harris, about how important that was to them, that it was a path-breaking vice presidential pick. And I think that turned out to be an extraordinarily good pick for Biden because it really ensured that he didn't have sort of a progressive indifference to his campaign as well. So the one congressional race that turned out to be extraordinarily close in Virginia, or very close, was Abigail Spanberger, Nick Freitas. And I always thought this was going to be close because this was a district that Trump carried by 5 or 6 points in 2016. He didn't carry it this time. He just missed carrying it. Biden was able to carry it by a little bit. And I think that was very important for Spanberger. And again, what we saw here was, almost a replay of what Biden did nationally. Spanberger ran up very large margins in Chesterfield County and Henrico County. I think she won Chesterfield by about 15,000 votes, Henrico by over 25,000 votes, and then did well enough in the places where, up in the northern part of the district where Freitas was from, to be able to stay in office. So at the end of the day, in Virginia, the congressional races, status quo, and I think Luria and Spanberger are very happy to have withstood this. Spanberger became quite vocal in the Democratic caucus afterwards, suggesting that she almost lost because of the talk of socialism, the talk of defunding the police, and this kind of stuff, and said, the Democratic Party has to do better messaging about what it wants to do rather than putting forward messages that are costing people elections. Finally, in Virginia, we had the redistricting amendment. That passed very, very easily. Not at all surprised. Almost all across the country, whenever people have been given the opportunity to form a bipartisan or a nonpartisan commission that will give citizens some say in the redistricting process, they pass it, and it passed here by a wide margin. Two things about this. First, the Democrats put this forward almost because they were in an ethical bind about this. For years, the Democrats had endorsed bipartisan redistricting. The Republicans had totally opposed it. Never were interested in it. But then as the Democrats gained power in the assembly, the Republicans all of a sudden became quite interested in bipartisan redistricting. And the Democrats were split. Some wanted it, said we can't be total hypocrites, others didn't. And ultimately enough Democrats and Republicans got behind it. It passed in the assembly, and then it was overwhelmingly approved by the voters. It's an odd thing in some ways. I don't know of any situation that I can recall where a political party gains legislative power for the first time in a generation, and as one of their initial acts concedes one of their greatest powers to a commission. I mean, I think you have to commend the Democrats for their virtue. The question will be, how will it look politically for them down the road? And I would just say, I can't imagine the Republican Party in Virginia or the country would have ever done anything like this. So it's a pretty unusual situation, and that's what we have. The commission itself is pretty interesting because it has 16 people, 8 legislators, 8 citizens. Citizens will be picked by a panel of judges from a pool presented to them by the legislators, I believe. 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats on the legislative side, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, probably on the citizen side. I'm not sure any independents are going to make this commission. So it's going to be a bipartisan commission. It's not going to be a quote unquote independent commission. The commission has a supermajority requirement in it that it's going to take 6 votes. I mean, it's supermajority requirements. It's going to take both 6 members of the legislative side and 6 members of the citizen side to agree on a map before it becomes the map. So there are 2 possible outcomes to that, I think. The first is that the map, they agree on a map. And if they agree on one, I'm betting that it's a map that's basically incumbent protection. Because I can't imagine what else Democrats and Republicans would agree on other than a map that largely solidifies the position that each side already has. Secondly, the alternative is that they don't agree on a map. And if that occurs, it goes to the Virginia Supreme Court, who would probably appoint a special master and an election law specialist to draw a map that they could approve in that front. I would say that I had had the opportunity to chair Bob McDonnell's Independent Advisory Redistricting Commission in the last go around. It had 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans. I was the independent chair. We produced maps that I thought were far better than the maps that the legislature typically produced, because we had, they were more compact. They were maps that citizens could understand who their legislators were. I think we did a much better job in the legislature, but I would say one caveat here: we couldn't agree on one map. So we presented a couple of maps. We presented 2 or 3 maps for the legislature, 2 or 3 maps for Congress, to show that there were better ways of doing it. But interestingly enough, even among the commission there, that was simply advisory, purely advisory. In fact, they took our maps and just threw it in the garbage. But even in that purely advisory commission, we couldn't come up with agreement on a map, on one map, on a single map. So it's a challenge to come to these agreements. And if you're going to do so with the supermajority requirements that they have, the experience of other states is supermajority requirements typically lead to incumbent protection maps. If I had to say at the end, this system is probably better than the existing system, which really stinks. But those people who think it's going to be great and going to usher in a new era of competitiveness might be a little wrong. The one thing that could happen is that there are demographic shifts that are going to take seats away from the rural areas, bring them more up to Northern Virginia, but they may actually put some Democrats into these exurban areas a little bit that are not as entirely Democratic in Spotsylvania, Stafford, and the like. So that could actually potentially benefit Republicans a little bit under a bipartisan plan rather than the partisan plan we have right now. Finally, let me just make a couple of suggestions about 2021 before we go get some of your questions. In Virginia, we have an election coming up every year. I always call it the political pundit full employment policy, because we'll be people will be talking to us, starting now. The election's already started. On the Democratic side, we saw that Terry McAuliffe has said that he is not interested in a position in the Biden administration, which I take to mean that he's running for governor. So the Democrats are going to have this 4-way race between the lieutenant governor, a former governor, Jen McClellan, a very popular state senator, and Jennifer Cowell-Foy, a real favorite of the progressives in the Democratic Party. So we're going to have to see how the Democratic Party can negotiate these multiple person races that they're going to have for governor, lieutenant governor. There's a 3-person race right now for Attorney General: Mark Herring, Shannon Taylor, Jay Jones. There's some question now whether or not Shannon Taylor will run, since Herring got in the race, so we'll have to see what happens on that. That could turn out to be a 2-way race. But it's going to be very interesting on the Democratic side, because McAuliffe left the governorship far more popular than when he came in. When he ran in 2013, there was some sense, well, this guy's kind of an operator. He's more of a kind of operative than he really is an executive. Can he really do a good job as governor? He beat Ken Cuccinelli, who's not a strong candidate, by only 2 points. But ultimately, I think people were very satisfied with the job he did as governor. He was, for Democrats, a very strong voice on social issues. He promoted, though he was not able to pass at the time, Medicaid expansion, and he was a great sort of economic, great in the role that governors have taken on as sort of the chief economic development officer. So he's going to have a lot of support, and that support's going to be widespread and broad. And he's a great fundraiser as well. But at the same time, there are Democrats like Jen McClellan, who's very well liked by Democrats. I've spoken to a number of people, even people who've worked for Terry McAuliffe, saying that I really like Terry, but I think it's time for a change. I think it's time for a woman candidate, give somebody else a chance. He should step aside. I don't know how strong that sentiment is, but there is some measure of that there. And then Jennifer Carroll Foy, of course, really represents a sort of new progressive wing of the party that has become far more powerful, especially in Northern Virginia than we've seen previously. She's going to have some funding from, it looks to me like Sonia Smith and Michael Bills, the Charlottesville couple that really put a lot of money into Democratic candidate politics. And so we're going to have a real interesting race. I don't quite know how what Justin Fairfax's constituency is right now, but see, he is certainly going to run on the notion that he has been the victim in many ways of a rush to judgment, and you know, he is going to align himself with those people who think that that is really a mistake and something that happens all too often, not only in Virginia but in America. On the Republican side, Amanda Chase has noted that she's interested in running. Senator Chase, she's running as kind of a mini Trump in some ways, I think. Somebody who represents the Trumpian view in Virginia. She is the hero in some fashion of the and one of the leaders, obviously, of the Second Amendment sanctuary movement that became so powerful last year and was approved. You know, we saw these resolutions approved in dozens of counties across Virginia, particularly in the rural areas, but not only the rural areas. So Chase, I think, you know, comes into this race with a base, but at the same time, it's not a base that likely can win a statewide election. It's the same issue that I mentioned before in Virginia about Republicans trying to find other candidates. So can they find a candidate who can be different? Kirk Cox, I think, is likely to get into the race, former Speaker of the House, certainly going to be receiving far more support from the Virginia business community than Amanda Chase. Perhaps Bill Carrico, former member of the legislature, gets in the race. There's a business person, Glenn Youngkin, getting in the race. And indeed, there's all kinds of Republicans now thinking about running for these other seats as well. The Democrats, you know, basically are thinking that if they can just repeat what they've done since 2005, they stay in good stead. The Republicans are hoping that with a Democratic president, with Joe Biden in, things are going to change very differently, and they're going to be able to point to, you know, problems of the national level. They're going to be able to talk to issues that the Democrats have endorsed at the state level, in terms of criminal justice, in terms of tax increases and the like, that they think can push them in good stead. I think the open question in Virginia for these statewide races is how toxic has the Republican brand become in these urban areas, metropolitan areas over the last 4 years with Donald Trump? And will that subside tomorrow on this front? If it does, the Republicans might be able to succeed. If not, it's going to be more challenging. Finally, I would say that there is a model for Republicans doing well in blue states. That model we can see next door in Maryland, we can see it in Massachusetts with Charlie Baker, and we can see it in Vermont. So Republicans have won governor's races in deep blue states, states that are actually bluer than Virginia, but they've done it with different candidates. They've done it with candidates who basically operate by promoting a very practical economic prosperity agenda and avoiding the social issues that seem to have galvanized so many Republicans around the state right now. So if come February, we're watching people come to the Capitol with AK-15s and being endorsed by all kinds of Republican office holders around the state, that's going to be, I think, continuing trouble for them. But they are hoping that a Biden presidency, the divisions in the Democratic Party, and a sense that the Democratic Party may be going too far in a progressive direction are going to give them an opportunity for a resurgence here. I've talked a long time. I'd love to take your questions.
Bob, thank you so much. That was outstanding. Linda and I both have questions here from participants. And let's start with one about mail-in balloting, the impact of that. And also, if you could speak to the future of mail-in balloting, or mail-in voting rather, in the United States.
Yeah, so that's great question. And I like to take that in terms of both mail-in balloting and early voting. So what you can see is that we had both mail-in balloting and early voting. I tend to believe, certainly in that broad category of early voting, we're likely to see more rather than less, unless legislators avoid it because they're worried about the outcomes. I think by and large, the public loves early voting. You know, if you take a look in Virginia, many of the metropolitan areas had early votes that were well over half of the total turnout, sometimes 2/3. And so if we want to increase participation, there's an easy way to do it. You just let people have an election season rather than an election day. I think the same is true of mail-in ballots. I think I don't see any problem with that. The states that have had mail-in ballots for years have done very well with them. They're not just Democratic states, they're Utah, Wyoming, and then, Wisconsin, Oregon. They've run elections with mail-in ballots very, very smoothly. So I'm hoping that we continue to move in that direction. Some of the challenges that we saw this year, or there are a couple of challenges, is that one in particular, if a state didn't get an early start on processing their mail-in ballots, it's taken a long time. And that is, that has caused some consternation in which people are talking about ballots that are counted late. They're not late ballots. They were in many instances the earliest ballots, but state legislatures sometimes said they couldn't start to process them until 7 p.m. election day, and that took some time. Indeed, I would tell you that there are many states that are still processing ballots, but we're not focusing on them because they're not states that are close. New York, California, Illinois. There's still a lot of ballots left out there. And in California, you're seeing some congressional races still being decided because these ballots take a while to count under any circumstance. But by and large, I think it's a great thing that we have these large turnouts and that we make it easier for people to vote. How legislators and state legislatures are going to react to this, I think, is the open question. So I think it's good for democracy. We'll have to see whether state legislatures like it. I think, and in retrospect, I think Donald Trump made a mistake by being so critical of mail-in ballots and telling his people not to do it. Now, they still came out. But by and large, a lot of Republicans were very uneasy with this because they said, we use mail-in ballots. That in fact, traditionally, in multiple states, Republicans did better with mail-in and absentee ballots, and they always waited for the mail-in and absentee ballots because they did well. And Donald Trump upended that tradition among the other traditions that he's upended here.
Thank you, Bob. I have a question about what the polling data suggested was a top concern of people going to the polls before the election versus after the election day. So before, the poll suggested that the coronavirus was the #1 concern on voters' minds, but at election day, it suggested that it was the economy. So the question is, does it always boil down to self-interest, or was there a shift in kind of a communitarian approach to self-interest?
I would say that the coronavirus and the economy, in some ways, are two sides of the same coin this year. If you're concerned about the coronavirus, I mean, in part, you may be concerned about catching it, getting it, and about did you like what the president's position was on it and how he was dealing with it, or did you not? Same time, the concerns about the economy were often related to the coronavirus. Did you think that there were too many shutdowns? Did you think that we had overreacted? Or were you upset because you had a small business that you weren't able to access funds on, that you were shut down, not able to access funds. Did this affect your job as it did many people? So I think in this election, it was very difficult to ferret out. You know, when you ask people, is it coronavirus or is it the economy? I'm not so sure we know. I think if people said the coronavirus, they were likely leaning Democratic. If they said the economy per se, they may have been leaning a little more on the Trump side. But I actually think in most people's minds, they were more interwoven than in the public sense of doing that, the way the public said. You know, particularly, you know, one of the examples that came up as well were the you know, protests for racial justice. And again, you had a significant number of people who said that was important to their vote in a number of states, but it wasn't always important in the same way. Again, you know, significant groups of people, probably a little larger, who felt that racism is still a continuing issue in the US, systemic racism is a continuing problem. And then you had others who thought that the protests and the potential and the violence and what that did to sort of economic life in some places, that was the problem. So again, you had an issue that people could identify as significant to their vote, but it didn't simply break down in one direction or another. But in terms of the coronavirus or the economy, I think they were interwoven, though one group of people were more likely to say coronavirus and another group were more likely to say the economy, even though in everybody's mind they're kind of connected.
Thanks, Bob. We've got some interest in your take on the future of the Affordable Care Act, especially given the oral arguments beginning today. And if you could address also some of the tides that you see going on at the court, given the new makeup, and address some of the Supreme Court issues.
Yeah, I mean, the court has now clearly gone into sort of a conservative majority side, majoritarian side. The court had been a conservative court in the sense that Chief Justice Rogers is certainly more conservative than liberal on most issues. However, he had a strong concern that the court would not be seen as a politicized institution, that it wouldn't be seen as totally predictable on this front. And so on a number of sort of controversial decisions, you might say, he joined the liberal majority and received a lot of disapprobation from and disapproval from conservatives across the country. But his interest is more in, how is the Roberts Court going to be perceived in history? And that it should not be perceived, as he said, as a Democratic court or a Republican court. At the moment now, the court is far more conservative in its general point of view. Now, how that's going to play out on every issue is never easy to discern. For example, we saw, one particular, gay rights issue where Gorsuch joined the liberal justices on that front there. But by and large, it would seem to me that this is a court that is going to be very, skeptical in some ways of, a lot of the positions that liberals have. Now, on the Affordable Care Act, I just don't know. I've been reading I read a few things in terms of the questions before that they were asking during the oral argument on this. By and large, this is going to be a real challenge for the court, I think, because the popularity of the Affordable Care Act in terms of its provision for pre-existing conditions is so strong that if the court eliminated that in some fashion, I would think that it would not only be lead to a very negative perception of the court, but it would upend the situation in the United States right now, where 20 million people essentially were given health care who didn't have access to it before. And it'll be interesting to see how the court deals with this issue. Do they deal with it as a standing issue, whether Texas has standing or doesn't have standing? Will they deal with it with a severability issue to basically suggest that you could, take one part of the Affordable Care Act out without necessarily impacting the pre-existing conditions part? But my sense is that there's an increasing belief in the United States that everyone should have certain kind of access to health care. I think there's a large debate about who should provide it and what the role of government should be in the private sector. But by and large, I think the argument that it's more of a right than a privilege is winning the day. And the notion of just going back to a situation where people could be denied coverage because of pre-existing conditions is something that I think even the court, and even a court that's just, that in which the majority of justices say, the only thing we do is interpret the letter of the law. We don't, we're looking at the law. We're not trying to make laws. I think it's going to be very tough for them to do that. Now, we'll see how that goes. I'm not a big fan of the originalism theories. Personally, I just don't know how they, I think there is some historical evolution that's occurred in the United States that has really changed our interpretation of the Constitution over time, but that's not the majority position right now, and we'll have to see how they do this. But I think this Affordable Care Act decision is going to be very interesting, because I think the members of the court know what impact that would have if all of a sudden they produced a decision that actually tossed out protections for pre-existing conditions.
Great, thank you, Bob. It's a lot to think about there. I have an interesting question about potential effect on elections in the future with this permanent telecommuting post-COVID. Some companies now saying that this is a thing that can stay, and there's a migration out of some of the urban cities into some of the more rural areas of the country. So any thoughts about how that diaspora could affect elections in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's going to be hugely large. I mean, I think, I actually think rather than going, and I mean, there's been this sort of mini exodus out of New York, into, either and it's usually by affluent people who can afford to go, first of all. But a lot of times, unless they're going to, in New York, you're seeing they go to some rural areas, and those people will largely, at least they'll always have a place in New York. They'll come back. I think there's some exodus to Florida and Texas and those kind of places. I think there's probably an exodus out of California a little bit as well. High cost of living places. I'm just not sure it's that large to have the kind of impact on elections that we're talking about. Maybe it will. But by and large, I think the people who are leaving will leave for one relatively popular place for another. And, I don't necessarily always believe they're going, if they have the means to leave, they're going to leave, they're going to live in another, they're actually going to go to rural areas for the most part. I think they're going to go to areas where they have a lifestyle that they really can enjoy. So it might not be an area as dense as Los Angeles or as dense as New York or Washington, D.C., but it might be the Richmonds and other metropolitan areas as well, in which there are, similar points of view and similar amenities, even at a lower scale.
Thanks, Bob. There's a question about Biden's talk and the impact of that talk. How do you see that as impacting the future of setting a direction? And several folks have mentioned about Biden's calming way and that could be restorative to healing. Any take on that? And I know it's hard to predict really, but thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I think he has struck all the right notes in his comments so far. And it was fascinating to me that I've been reading, a couple of reporters who have known him for 30 or 40 years. And many of these reporters were totally unimpressed with him. They said for many years, they said, every time we talked, this guy, every time, have a conversation, this guy would just, go on and bloviate on for, 30 minutes about answering one question. You never could get a word in edgewise. And they said, and he's obviously changed. He seems more serious. He seems, clearly, he's been impacted by the kind of life and challenges that he's had over time. And that he really was very, very impressive in striking all the right notes about, not being a president of the red states or the blue states, but of the United States, talking about how he's going to be the president for the people who voted against him as well as the people who voted for him. And I think a lot of people want to hear that. I mean, I think that's true. The challenge is that enough to break through this intense, extraordinary, and increased polarization that impacts so many aspects of people's lives and that dominates the political arena. So a lot of people are talking, well, he'll be able to deal with Mitch McConnell. Maybe. He was vice president and they had a tough time dealing with Mitch McConnell. McConnell basically said that his first saw his job as preventing Obama from being reelected on this front. So that's the challenge. There's a thirst in the public for some kind of political system that can actually work, where people actually compromise, where they respect one another, they're not screaming at one another every day. But at the same time, the forces against that are huge. And so I think there's a degree of hopefulness about this. But, the realists, will say, well, Trump's not going away. Trumpism is not going away. That you're going to have people screaming at Biden every day. So we'll just have to see about how he does on that front. As I said, I can't imagine that he could have done better, given his skills and given his capacities than he has over the last week in his comments and his emphases and the way he goes about things. I mean, it looks to me very, very good. But he has an awful lot of sort of cultural and political trends to confront to actually move toward a time where we come together more often and compromise on the big issues and try to find out what's in common rather than what divides us.
Thank you, Bob. I know we're nearing our time, but we'd be remiss. There are several folks are asking on your thoughts on the Richmond mayoral race and the future of RVA given that, and also if Terry McAuliffe does come back as governor, LeVar's future, and there's a whole bunch wrapped around there. So if you could just take a few minutes. Okay,
I'll try to do my best on this. I was not surprised by the outcome of the Richmond mayoral race. I had told a lot of reporters previously that I really thought LeVar was going to win it. So, what you had here is that you had LeVar Stoney, who came in as a mayor in a multi-person race where he beat Jack Berry and Joe Morrissey. And largely at that time, because he had the support of what I call the Democratic Party establishment, that it was a presidential year, as you have the Richmond mayor's race, And if you are seen by the party establishment as a Democratic Party candidate, you're likely to carry the city. And he was able to do so, even though he didn't have a lot of experience as an executive or a lot of experience in the city of Richmond. Then came up this year, with running for re-election, and was running for re-election in a difficult time, both because of COVID-19, but then also because of the challenges that emerged in the city with the issues about the removal of the monuments. And so what happened is that he wound up with opponents on his left and his right. On his right, he had Councilwoman Kim Gray, who ran with the support of I think a lot of Republicans, and with a large part of the business community that really felt that LeVar had mishandled the protests, that downtown had become boarded up, that it had been that he had been in many ways too lenient with the violence that had occurred, was not handling COVID well in terms of the business outcomes of this, and that there were folks who were opposing LeVar because of that. It wasn't the broad business community, but I think a lot of the small business community, the restaurateurs, the small business owners who had tried to really make a go of being downtown, they were very, very opposed to LeVar. And on the left, he had Alexis Rogers, who was a progressive candidate, who basically took the point of view that LeVar had become too cozy with the corporate community during Navy Hill. You had a whole sort of grassroots progressive movement, that kind of a ragtag movement that actually succeeded in getting enough council members not to support Navy Hill. Actually, that could potentially come back now with the new council, but the progressive groups were very strong, very vocal, and they did a remarkable job in doing that. And then same progressives were very upset with what they considered to be excessive police violence during the protests about the removal of the monuments there. So LeVar was kind of in the middle, where he removed the monuments, which again generated even more lawsuits, but removed them, and had this challenge on his right and his left. I thought that Kim Gray ran a poor campaign. I think she's a very smart, bright, committed person. But having said that, I don't think that she ran a campaign that was directed toward all of Richmonders very well. And I was surprised, because she had done some great things. She had been really the moving force behind renaming the boulevard Arthur Ashe Boulevard. I think she should have highlighted that more. When I looked at her mailings, I thought I was reading a Republican campaign. They're about tax increases, fearing tax increases, things of that sort. And I thought, this is an 80% Democratic city. This is not the message that's going to win this campaign. And if you saw LeVar, he had some strengths. LeVar is a very visible guy in the community, been very visible for 4 years. He's not a mayor who has been sort of backed off and hasn't been around. He's out in the community, he's in the schools, he's talking to people all the time. And he's well liked by a lot of people, not everybody, but I thought well liked by enough. And if you look, and then he talked about taking the monuments down. I've taken them down. That was part of his pitch on television. And if you look at what happened, in most of the Black majority districts, LeVar Stoney did extremely well there. So I always thought that his message was tailored much more to that. I'd spoken, I guess, about a week before the election with his campaign chief and one of his other notable advisors, and they seemed to me to be a little worried about the campaign. They were worried, and I thought at the time, he's going to win, because he's going to win these districts. And ultimately it turned out that he won a majority of the districts. He didn't win a majority of the vote, but he won a majority of the districts there. In terms of his future, It's interesting to me that I think there's some people who think that taking the monuments down is going to hurt his future. I think it's going to help his future. If you're thinking of running statewide in a Democratic primary and you were the guy who took the monuments down in Richmond, I don't see any way that it's going to harm you. I think if he has a challenge in the future is that as the Democratic Party's progressive wing becomes a little more, a little more powerful inside the Democratic Party, I think the alliance with Dominion Energy and Tom Farrell on Navy Hill is far more of a problem for him than taking down the monument, which I think he's going to see as a positive, like he did in this campaign, and not a negative. So I'm hoping that we can begin to, once we get through this COVID situation, sort of reinvigorate RVA again. My sense is that the positives are well above the negatives in Richmond, and I think in due time, the people who are basically saying the city is going to the dogs and is going downhill will not be on the correct side of what happens here.
Wonderful news for RVA, and let's hope that that is true. The one final question, we've got several more questions, but let's do one final one, Bob. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party, a reaction to Trump and Trumpism, or a trend that we will look forward to seeing grow? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think the trends are going to grow. It's a reaction to Trump and Trumpism, but not only that. It's a reaction inside the Democratic Party, and this is the fight the Democratic Party is going to have and have to deal with. The Democratic Party in Virginia has had a very successful winning formula, and that formula for statewide races, and that formula has been liberal and progressive on social issues, but moderate on economic development and business issues. It's Ralph Northam's position. It's Terry McAuliffe's position. I mean, McAuliffe reminded me, in terms of an economic development salesman, of George Allen. I mean, they both were these great salesmen and promoters of Virginia. It's Mark Warner's position. So while there are sort of nuances between these candidates, the successful Virginia candidate has had that view. We're going to be liberal, we're going to be a rock on these social issues. But on the other hand, we're going to be moderate and progressive on business issues. And even people who are really kind of on the liberal side, when you come to be a governor and you're promoting economic development, trying to bring jobs in, you turn out to be moderate. And so that was Tim Kaine, who might have been, I think, the most liberal person that I had known elected as Virginia governor, if you look back at his prior political life. But at the same time, when he became governor, was moderate on social issues. So that's the formula. What now happened in the last legislative session is that you've seen progressive Democrats, especially in Northern Virginia, I might add, but not only, they exist otherwise. They're talking about climate change. They're very upset with the role that Dominion Resources has had in influencing the state legislature to remove sort of powers from their perspective from the State Corporation Commission. They said they're not taking Dominion money. They don't take that kind of money very often. They are more in favor of things like the minimum wage, project labor agreements for unions. And this movement is there. They almost defeated Dick Saslaw when he was running for re-election in a primary, would have defeated him if they had only one person in the race. But they had two. Saslaw got about 47%, somebody else got 45%, and I think one other person got 6%. So they'll probably go after Chap Peterson in 2023 in the Senate. And there are any number of House members who are really far more progressive than we've seen traditionally in the Senate. So I think that's going to be a challenge for the Democratic Party, just like I've spoken about a challenge for the National Democrat. In the generation they had taken power, they all agreed on not 100%, but 80% of things that they wanted to do. both economically, both in terms of criminal justice reform, preserving various kinds of individual rights, on discrimination against the LGBTQ community. They all agreed on this. They disagreed on some other things. Those disagreements are likely to become more prominent as they go forward. I don't think that's going away. And finally, I would also say that the progressive energy that you have, particularly among young people who get involved in politics, is crucial for the Democratic Party. So that's their challenge, that in some ways, the things that might win them the most votes are not the positions that actually generate the most enthusiasm, and trying to find some way to combine that is what one of their major challenges going forward. Thanks very much. It's been great.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bob. I hope you're hearing of over 100 people who participated in this, clapping and appreciating your wisdom as always. It is great. Thank you for being here, Trevor Granarud. Thank you so much for managing our situations and technologically, and Linda Pierce, of course, my co-host. Darren, final words from you, sir.
No, just real quickly, a big thanks again to Bob and for sharing his time and insights with us again today. It's always informative every time I get the chance to listen to you and hear from you. So thanks again to everybody that attended and participated. That goes for CMA as well. We had graduates of CMI also join us today. So very much thank them for joining. And just lastly, in addition to a big thanks to Jim and Linda and Trevor and Mandy, we will be sending out a thank you email to all who attended and asking for feedback as well. So look for that. And again, big thanks. I can't think of a better way to spend my lunch hour.
Thank you so much, Darren. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Darren. So great to see everyone.